Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC, and your host. I know many of you were surprised to find us here today in the third week of August. We are surprised to find ourselves here. We had planned on hiatus till September, but events being what they are, well, here we are, and we're really glad that you are here with us today. We have a very large audience, which I suspect is not just that the course of events is interesting, but our guest, Thomas Jocelyn of the Long War Journal, is a really great analyst of these things, and I know you've come for him. But before we get to Thomas, let's do the JPC commercial. JPC was established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization. We provide analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. There you will see our insight articles, our magazine In Focus Quarterly, the fall issue of which will be out in the middle of September, our blog In Context, as well as our Alliance Tracker and Frontline Defense blogs. There is a lot of material on the website. I hope we'll go there and take a poke. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. In this series of calls, we've been pleased to bring you scholars and policymakers on issues including China in various permutations, Israel, including but not only the Abraham Accords, Iran sanctions, as well as the Supreme Court, the defense budget, and domestic extremism, and Turkey. Today, of course, we begin with the debacle in Afghanistan, but we won't stay there. You can watch CNN for the pictures of the airport. CNN's Clarissa Ward, by the way, has been brave and outstanding. So if you want to see the pictures, find Clarissa Ward on CNN. We're going to talk about what the fall of Kabul means in the region, for the future, and for the United States. Now, your public service announcement, you are, as you know, muted. Send questions on your chat. We are monitoring them during the program. We also have the questions that you guys sent in with your registrations. So we're going to do a lot of Q&A today. And now our program. Thomas Jocelyn is Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and Senior Editor of FDD's Long War Journal, a widely read publication on counterterrorism and related issues. You should go online and look that up as well. Much of his research focuses on how al-Qaeda and Islamic State operate around the world. We're going to talk about it naturally in Afghanistan. He has served as a consultant to the FBI Counterterrorism Division, and he has testified many times before Congress, including to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the House Committees on Homeland Security, Foreign Affairs, Armed Services, excuse me, and the Judiciary. Previously, as a result of Thomas's efforts, the CIA declassified and released a vast majority of the files captured in Osama bin Laden's compound. In 2007, he published a monograph entitled Iran's Proxy War Against America, which probably could use an update. We'd love to hear about that, Thomas. And earlier, he did an exhaustive review of the Guantanamo Bay detainee population, cataloging and analyzing thousands of pages of declassified documents. I don't know how much of this he's going to get into, but I am fascinated by the fact that Thomas has constructed dossiers on hundreds of terrorists during the course of his work. He's been described as one of the most trusted authorities on al-Qaeda network because of his encyclopedic knowledge of terrorist biographies. Thomas publishes the Vital Interest newsletter for the Dispatch and co-hosts the Generation Jihad podcast. His work has been published in a variety of places. You know the places, it's all the places. And he makes regular appearances in the media. And today he makes an appearance with us. Thomas Jocelyn, I'm pleased to say the floor is yours.
Oh, well, thank you for that introduction, Shoshana, and thank you to JPC for inviting me to talk about this in August. I know you guys were planning on being on a break and not talking about this, and unfortunately, current affairs have sidelined any vacation time here, at least for this window. For me, I've been working nonstop basically for 8 or 9 days now, so there's a lot still going on, unfortunately. But I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody here, and thank you all for tuning in today. I wish we could do this in person too. I always find it's better to connect with people in person and get their facial expressions and see who's connecting with you and who's not. So it's a little awkward for me to be sitting here in my home office and talking into a screen, but we'll make do as we can. I'm going to make just a few brief points and then turn it over to Q&A because Shoshana sent me a lot of the questions that were submitted beforehand. There's a lot of great questions, and I think it would be better to sort of have that sort of Socratic method to basically go through this and figure out some answers here for everybody. But I'll make 3 or 4 couple quick points. The first, we're not going to dwell on the past too much, but I want to just say that what you're witnessing in Kabul right now is the result of almost an unfathomable setbacks in American leadership and American leadership mistakes over the course of multiple administrations. So it's not just what you're seeing in the last few months here. This goes back way back. There were foundational problems in this war that we've been documenting in the Long War Journal. And it's almost incomprehensible to the layperson to understand, to think about the how many mistakes have been made and how dishonest really a lot of the accounting on this has been. It's very problematic for me, and I'm hoping as we go forward that there will be accountability for all this to some degree, or an attempt at least to get at the foundational problems that I'm talking about. And that leads me to my second point. One of the foundational problems, and again, it just seems ridiculous, but I'll argue this to the end of my life. The U.S. never really understood who they were fighting in Afghanistan. If you look at just recently, President Biden said during a press conference on Friday that al-Qaeda was gone from Afghanistan. Some people said this was a slip of the tongue. I would say that the inclination of America's political elite has been across both parties, or at least across 3 different administrations now, has been to make that claim in one version or another. It was a claim that's rooted in the policy desire to get out. And in fact, most of the last 10 years, America has just been trying to get out of Afghanistan as opposed to actually fighting to win or actually trying to affect some other policy outcome that makes sense. So the bottom line from my perspective there is that no, al-Qaeda is not gone from Afghanistan. But if you were to ask a lot of senior policymakers or politicians or even people in the intel bureaucracy about al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, it's not a real organization for them. Part of what we learned is that it became an abstraction in the minds of many people in Washington. As the nerd who studies all these biographies, these terrorists, it's not an abstraction for me. I live with these people in my head, and I think I've come to understand quite a few of them and how they think and what motivates them. But what I realized a long time ago is that that's not true for a lot of people who comment on this stuff. Al-Qaeda to this day is not really well understood. And so one quick example on that regard is that the relationship between al-Qaeda and the Taliban is still strong. Al-Qaeda is not gone from Afghanistan. Just since November of last year, we've tracked firm evidence showing that they are in at least 18 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. And one of the great questions that Shoshana showed me earlier, and I'll have to answer it now because it's such a good question and something I've dealt with, is that in fact, Surajun Haqqani, and this is the only name I'm going to drop on you. My mother always says, anytime I use Arabic names or any kind of Pakistani or Afghan names, she always calls me and says, don't do that. Nobody can understand what you're saying. But I'll have to use this one. Surajun Haqqani, who is the number 2 of the Taliban, is a man who's deeply in bed with al-Qaeda. He and his family really built al-Qaeda. And if he's not al-Qaeda, then he is as close to al-Qaeda as you can become without being al-Qaeda. So he in fact, his victory here in Afghanistan, and his victory because he's the warlord or the shogun of the Taliban's military forces, that is in fact a victory for al-Qaeda. And we're going to be living with this for some time to come, I'm afraid. And that brings me to my final point before we get to the questions, is that this is in fact a boon for the global jihadi movement and al-Qaeda globally. One of the things that we've learned in doing this for so many years is that, as I said, al-Qaeda became an abstraction for a lot of people. And so they began to think of al-Qaeda in all these different places as just different iterations of an ideology with no kind of cohesion to the organization. And we have documented time and again why that's false, and that al-Qaeda actually retains 20 years after 9/11 and a cohesive international organization. And so what we were documenting right now, in fact, right before I came on to talk to you today, we were translating statements from Arabic to English so people can read them for themselves, or at least parts of them. We're documenting how al-Qaeda in West Africa, East Africa, Syria, Yemen, different components throughout South Asia and elsewhere are all saluting today. They're all cheering today. They are all celebrating today, saying that this is a monumental victory for them and their cause. And it is a reason that, from their perspective, it's a reason to show that their violence, their terrorism, their jihadism has been validated. That they, the Mujahideen, beat the Soviets the first time around in Afghanistan, and now the second iteration of them, the jihadists, have beaten America the second time around. And in fact, that individual I mentioned earlier, Sir Arjun Haqqani, it was his father that declared victory over the Soviets on behalf of the Mujahideen. Now today, he, the son, and you can just think of the psychological import of this, the son gets to declare victory over the Americans. And so this is a major development here in the history of jihadism. Of course, it's a boon for al-Qaeda. And I'm afraid that this is going to play out and have ramifications probably for a generation to come. So we can talk a little bit about why that is, and hopefully Shoshana will ask me a little bit about Iran and al-Qaeda and some other related matters here, because I'm sure everybody would be interested to hear about that. But let's get to it. Let's get to some questions so we can get into this.
Okay, let's start with a setup question. You are the editor of the Long War Journal. World War II was only 6 actual years long. The rest of our position in Europe and the Pacific, which some people equate to long wars, wasn't about leftover Nazis. It was about agreed upon security service purposes. So tell us what a long war is, and is it actually a way to defeat people? Do we have to plan to be at war for generations? Those guys look like they're going to be at war with us for generations.
No, you asked me about this. Is a great question, because this actually gets to the heart of some of the problems here. Long war was a term that bubbled up in the Pentagon very briefly to describe the effort against jihadists, al-Qaeda, and then its various derivatives. But it speaks to how the American side in this war never stuck to a formal definition or any kind of definition really of who they were fighting, because that concept was quickly jettisoned. And you'll recall that what was formerly known as the Global War on Terror slowly devolved into what was known as overseas contingency operations, which is really just gibberish. What are overseas contingency operations? They don't say exactly who you're fighting or what motivates your enemies. But so actually my colleague, right before I joined Long War Journal, adopted this name. And I've said ever since then that I would have preferred to have said, should have been a short war journal, because we all would have liked a short war that would have been over. But why has it been a long war? Well, I've teased sort of there have been many mistakes on the American side. But the fundamental thing about our enemy side, or the jihadist side, is that they're not organized like conventional military forces like those that we saw defeated in World War II. They are organized as insurgents, guerrilla fighters. That's how they're organized. And as anybody who's studied insurgencies knows, they can be bedeviling. They can be very difficult to overcome and defeat. And they've actually studied the jihadists, al-Qaeda. Most people don't know this. They actually studied the Vietnamese insurgency. They actually studied Mao. They studied how to develop themselves and build themselves into an insurgency force that would be capable of reconquering Kabul all these many years later. And so that insurgency platform that they have has proliferated now. So you have al-Qaeda insurgencies, and of course you have ISIS insurgencies as well, which is a little bit different, but draws from the same well in, all over the globe, all over Africa, all throughout the Middle East and elsewhere. And so these insurgencies are primed to fight a long war, and they're going to continue fighting a long war, whether America fights it or not.
Thank you. That's a good answer. We have to think about what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. We've had several questions on the subject of Pakistan, so I'm going to put them together into one kind of Pakistan package. First is, are the goals of the Taliban purely within the borders of Afghanistan, or do they threaten to destabilize Pakistan? On the obverse side, Pakistan formed, housed, and runs the Taliban, and the US supports Pakistan significantly. Is it fair to say that the US could have pushed our allies, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, to curtail or stop the Taliban at some point in the past? And finally, does the US government fear for the future of the Pakistani government?
No, these are all great questions, and I'm glad you packaged them together because they are all related. So I'll preface this by saying that, first of all, Long War Journal has been banned in Pakistan for over 8 years. So the Pakistani government has actually physically banned our website. So if you are in Pakistan and you want to actually read Long War Journal, you have to go through a proxy server or find some other way to finagle connection, because the Pakistani government doesn't want you to read us. And the reason they don't want you to read us is because of what I've described as the wheel of jihad, which is that the Pakistani government, the military intelligence services, have been deeply in bed with the Afghan Taliban's leadership, Khanis, including the guy I just mentioned, and others. and they have played a vital role in providing safe havens and support for the insurgency that has now captured Kabul. This gets tricky though, because and this is why it's a wheel, because so just as they are in bed with the Afghan Taliban leadership, which is in bed with al-Qaeda, there are other groups that are part of this jihadi consortium, which are fight alongside these guys every day, including the Pakistani Taliban, who actually are coming back around to attack the Pakistani state and have been for some time. And so the possible fundamental miscalculation that the Pakistani establishment has made here is that what happens in Afghanistan doesn't stay in Afghanistan. And one of the first places that it spills over is Pakistan. And we've been documenting on a daily basis how jihadis, including the Pakistani Taliban, which is openly loyal to the Afghan Taliban, has been carrying out terrorist attacks almost every single day in Pakistan. So no, the Afghan Taliban is not purely nationalist. This was one of the Taliban apologia sort of parts of revisionist history that has sunk in, unfortunately, amongst American policymakers. And Shoshana, you mentioned Clarissa Ward. I'll point to some footage on CNN she did where she was interviewing a fighter recently. I don't know if you saw this, where the fighter said, our goal was for Sharia to be implemented here in Afghanistan, but that's not the end. Someday Sharia will be implemented all over the world. And there's quite a bit of the Taliban, including the Haqqanis, who run the leadership and are integral part of the hierarchy of both the military and political parts of the Taliban machine. There's quite a bit of the Taliban that thinks along those lines. I mean, are there parts of the Taliban that don't? Sure, they're not, not automatons, but quite a few of the leaders do, and quite a few of the fighters do. Then you asked me about the America pushing the Pakistan. If everybody remember back to one of the fundamental problems in this war in Afghanistan was the initial invasion that overthrew the Islamic Emirate in late 2001 came with a set of diplomatic criteria or demands that the State Department, then led by Secretary of State Colin Powell and his right arm in this, Dick Armitage, no pun intended, issued a number of demands of the Pakistani state. And you can look these up online. They're in the 9/11 Commission report and elsewhere. And if you go through those demands, you'll realize that basically only one of the 10 or 11 demands was ever satisfied. The other 10 were not. And part of the failure here is that there's been no consistent American leadership to hold Pakistan accountable for failing to live up to those other demands. And so we've only seen furtive attempts really to hold the Pakistanis accountable, including withholding aid for a time in 2017 and things along those lines. So there's never been a real systematic hold on that. And I'm trying to think, the last question was, America fear Pakistan. I think part of the reason why America hasn't come up with a consistent game plan when it comes to Pakistan is that it has had throughout much of the last 20 years the fastest growing nuclear arsenal. It is a state that's teeming with jihadism and Islamism and extremism that's unstable. The thinking in American quarters is we need the military to keep it together, because who knows what happens if they can't. But I would say that calculation came at the cost, in particular, of losing the war in Afghanistan to the jihadis who have been in bed with the Pakistani state. So it's a complicated thing, and I think Pakistan may have miscalculated here. You're going to see a surge in jihadism in Pakistan itself in the coming months.
We were going to talk later about accountability and things, and nation building, but let's do it here. One of the things that President Obama did very specifically as relates to Pakistan and Afghanistan is he gave a speech at West Point, and he said, we're going to call it AFPAC, and we're going to help the Afghans have a government. We're going to help the Pakistanis have a government, and we're going to teach the women to read, and all those things that we had already said we were going to do. President Obama doubled down, and he did the Afghan surge, and he made it very clear that the parameters were Afghanistan and Pakistan together. Talk to us, if you would, about nation building, and what does it mean when we say that the way to solve the jihadi problem, I don't even know how I want to call the problem. Jihadi problem, Sharia problem, terrorism problem. The way to do that is to build societies of Western-oriented people. That's what he wanted, and he put a lot of money in it anyway.
Well, it's interesting you brought up President Barack Obama, because at least the last time I checked his Twitter feed and I checked for public statements from him, I didn't see anything about the debacle that's unfolding in Afghanistan from him. I didn't see a comment, or, he commented on Haiti, which is totally perfectly fine and deserves comment. Of course it does in news coverage, but he didn't have anything to say about this. And I think that when I talk about the failures in political leadership, that's part of what I'm talking about, is that we've had presidents who didn't really care about this and didn't really want to deal with this. And given the rhetoric that you just cited, what I would say is that, keep in mind too, that more Americans died during the surge under President Obama in Afghanistan fighting than during the rest of the war. That actually America took on more casualties during that period than during the rest of the war. And yet the commander in chief who oversaw that has been remarkably silent throughout all of this and has had nothing to say. And that's because he had an ambivalence about being there in the first place. Despite the flowery rhetoric about teaching girls to read and building a civil society, remember his surge came with an 18-month timestamp on it or timeline. That basically we're going to fight for 18 months and then we're going to start getting out. And then by the end of 2014 and by the middle of 2011, that so-called surge had ended that he announced in late 2009. Then by 2014, he announced the end of America's combat operations in Afghanistan. Now think about that for a second, though, from a warfighting perspective. How can you stay in a country that's ravaged by war, where the other party is continuing to fight, and you're going to say, well, we're going to stay, but we're not going to have combat operations or fight? Now, of course, America did continue to have combat operations, but it speaks to the psychological ambivalence and cognitive dissonance here that really sunk in on this war and explains a lot of the failures, I would argue, because America stayed there even after its political leaders had quit on the war and didn't want to be there. So going forward on nation building, this is an incredibly complicated topic. What I would say is that it's not true that America has been uniformly nation building in Afghanistan throughout time. It is true that an awful lot of money was wasted. It's also true that America has essentially rearmed the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, making it stronger, giving it a stronger infrastructure and military than it had 20 years ago. This is a monumental debacle. It is true that America wasted money in all sorts of democracy promoting efforts. It is true. But if you go back to the history of it, it's much worse than that in some ways, because there was never any consistent effort. I mean, most people don't know this, but for the first several years of the war, the effort to train Afghan security forces really fell on our European allies. They were supposed to, for the first 5 years, to build up an Afghan security force that could hold its own so we wouldn't have to be there. They didn't really do that. And so then America takes over that mission at the end of the Bush administration, the beginning of the Obama years. And that was really what drove Obama's surge. Was he wanted to just build up the Afghans quickly overnight and then leave. And it doesn't work that way. You can't work that way. But that's part of the problem that is now, over the last decade now, has unfolded. And you've seen, our last two decades really, has unfolded to the point where the Afghan forces crumbled under the Taliban's offensive.
So where is accountability for this? Is this a military failure, or our troops didn't train well enough? Is it a political failure? Americans like to assign blame. I mean, we just do. We don't want to leave the fiasco of Afghanistan and not understand what happened to us. So who takes the rap for this?
It starts at the political class. We need better political leadership. I'm going to criticize the military in a second, but look, I mean, you can go through the way for all of his faults, I think President Bush had there was something correct in his thinking when he talked about decision points, that each president has to synthesize this monumental amount of information and make a decision based on the information at hand. And what I would argue is that American presidents have made the wrong decision time and time again when it comes to the Afghan war. And this is not hindsight as 2020, because you can go through the Long War Journal and you can go through my prolific writings and talking through years, and you can see I've been saying this for years, right? You don't have to make this decision; you can make another one. And really it goes back to the 1990s. Remember, President Bill Clinton passed up multiple opportunities to kill bin Laden and kill some of the senior al-Qaeda leadership in drone strikes. That's in the 9/11 Commission report. President Bush, unfortunately, in late 2001, he didn't get he passed on a problem to Barack Obama because he didn't kill Osama bin Laden. He could have done more to send American forces for a use of overwhelming force for a discrete period of time to really finish the senior al-Qaeda leadership, and he didn't. And that was a costly mistake for reasons people don't even realize. Then Barack Obama comes in, and he doesn't really want to fight this war, but has a surge and then ends it and then says, we're not going to fight at all, and we're going to have combat operations come home. And then he also pursued this fanciful peace talks with the Taliban, and really a lot of apologia for the Taliban sunk in. And then President Trump, he comes in 2017. He wants out, right? He says over and over again, I want out. He agrees to stay. And then by 2018, he says, we're out, and the Taliban's our counterterrorism partner. I mean, this is the type of nonsense in political leadership that you've seen. So it starts with erratic political leadership. And then the military leadership, military service members, and a lot of those guys did a great job with a bad hand, and they absolutely deserve our respect. I've been dealing with a lot of veterans who are very upset by this, obviously, and I've been telling them, look, you fought to keep my family safe and so many Americans safe. Your leaders may not have understood what you were doing, but you were really on the front lines against these barbarians who threaten us all. So
Yeah, I have to say on that, my daughter and son-in-law and godsons, all military veterans, all Afghanistan and Iraq, and you are so right. An awful lot of young men and women did amazing work, which is part of the reason I think people ask this question about accountability, because you know, a lot of people died in this effort, and the question is, for what? You know, what comes out of it? And I think we don't know yet. So let's move. Go ahead.
I just say something on that, Shoshana. That's why when I say to policymakers, I always use it may be flippant, but it's a way to get them to think about it. I say the juice better be worth the squeeze, right? That whatever you do, you know, when you make a decision, if you're going to put American lives on the line, you know, you better have a clear understanding of why you're doing that, and that you have an outcome in mind that makes sense for doing that. And my problem with the way this war has been fought is that, to my mind, the political leadership has been so cavalier in that regard in terms of what was going on at times, and not really paying attention to what was going on. Now, that said, remember from 2014 on, the Afghans really did shoulder the burden in terms of casualties here, not the Americans. You know, 66,000 Afghan soldiers and security forces died in this war under feckless leadership from our generals. And, you know, the casualty rate for the Americans was much, much, much lower, you know, a small percentage of that, very small. So
we need better political leadership, and perhaps we need military officers better able to make their case for the military rights and wrongs of what they're doing to the political leadership.
I agree, totally.
This is a split problem.
Totally.
Okay. So now we're looking at the outcomes, and I want to move across borders. What does the future look like between China and the Taliban? We know China wants some things. We know the Taliban been big supporters of the Uyghurs, Turkic peoples, and is there room here for the Taliban and China to trade off things that they want?
Well, you know, it's interesting, and you know, you see President Biden and the State Department and others are saying that, you know, the Taliban wants international legitimacy. This is not really true. They want legitimacy on their own terms, not Western style international legitimacy. They want to be respected as jihadi warriors and as the victors in Afghanistan, not in any sense in a Western sort of way of thinking legitimacy. But part of the problem with that rhetoric you see coming out of Washington is that we don't live in a unipolar world anymore. You know, America's leadership has declined because of the fecklessness of our leaders, you know, and for a lot of the problems we face. And so we live in a multipolar world in which China and Russia are very much willing to give the Taliban the legitimacy they seek without asking them to really change, you know. And the Taliban had a delegation in Beijing not too long ago in which they were warmly welcomed. And it was the same delegation that really negotiated the surrender or the capitulation of the Americans in Doha in February 2020. So while America was surrendering to them, just over a year later, you have them getting legitimacy from the Chinese. And the Russians have already signaled that they're willing to play ball. And so this is not a case where these other bad actors are going to shun the Taliban. Now, you asked about the Uyghur cause. This speaks to how well, I have to give you a nerd point here, if you don't mind, for 1 second. So one of the things that bothers me about this inability to define the enemy, there's a group called the Turkestan Islamic Party in Afghanistan. It's made up primarily of Uyghurs, but they also have, and it's also in Syria, by the way. And they have, but they have Western forces in them, Western fighters in them. They have other ethnicities in them, not just Uyghurs, right? Well, for a long time, when you look at how the U.S. government would define al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, they wouldn't define the Turkestan Islamic Party as. And yet, in the files that I got out of Osama bin Laden's compound, one of them shows that the head of the Turkestan Islamic Party, and the guy who still leads it to this day, was on bin Laden's payroll. So he's actually receiving a monthly stipend from bin Laden himself and from bin Laden's personal accounts. And yet the US definition of the enemy didn't consider Turkestan Islamic Party to really be part of al-Qaeda's forces or force structure in Afghanistan. And this is one of many fault lines, I would say here. Now, what we've seen from the Taliban already is that they're saying that they won't allow this group to attack inside of China's borders. I think that remains to be seen. And I think there are other ways they can go after the Chinese, including in Pakistan, by the way, that would satisfy the itch of this group to really go after the Chinese.
That is an interesting sidelight. I had no idea, and I suspect our listeners didn't either. I have to backtrack for a second to nation building because we got a question from a retired Marine general. And I always think that questions by Marine generals should be answered. It says, was our nation building misdirected in this sense, trying to build a government in Afghanistan similar to ours, rather than what might work for them?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely. And in fact, that problem also was compounded on the military side, because the military that the U.S. and its allies built was a Western style military that wasn't built to fight the wars that Afghans fight. So that is absolutely correct. And that's a problem that really, look, I mean, again, there wasn't a consistent effort to build the Afghan government, Afghan security forces. So I don't want to say it was a 20-year effort, that was consistent or well thought out. But to the extent that there was an effort, it was that, and it was flawed.
So it seems to me that also could be directed toward our interest in the Palestinian Authority and making a Western style government there, or a Western style government in Libya, or a number of other places where we've either demanded that people do it or encouraged people to do it. So maybe that's another area in which we need, I hate to say multiculturalism because it brings to mind so many other things, but maybe we do need to actually be much more aware of what people really do in their own space.
The way I would say that is that you just have to accept the world as it is. You can't, if you look at the history of our democracy in America, it's enormously complex how it was birthed. And it was a combination of very unique historical circumstances and leadership and other factors that came together to do this. It was not something that was done easily. And the problem is that, you can't have this sort of, basically this common blueprint that you're going to impose on all these different societies. It just doesn't work that way. And so I think America has to play the cards that it's dealt, instead of trying to constantly ask for a new deck,
On the other hand, Taiwan has become a democracy, and Japan
Sure.
has, and South Korea has places that didn't have the same democratic setups that we did. So maybe it's not impossible. Maybe it's a long war. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a long war. It's not impossible. I'll say this: you raised the World War II question. One of the differences here between this conflict and World War II is that, remember, in World War II, Nazism was definitively defeated and discredited as an ideology, an organization, and a government. In Japan, the cult of the emperor was defeated decisively, unfortunately with 2 atom bombs, but that's what it took to break that whole system. The problem with jihadism and the system is it hasn't been broken. So as a defining ideology, and with with organizations that exploit it, they were never broken. This is part of the problem, is that America spent most of the last 12 years, I would argue, claiming that al-Qaeda was actually defeated or close to defeated without actually defeating it. So this is part of the problem. This is why, the inability to speak the truth about these things got us into a lot of trouble. And I fear there's more trouble ahead.
Perhaps the trouble will be in the next area that a listener presents to us. What is the likelihood that Iran will actually align with the Taliban to the detriment of Israel? Hamas and Hezbollah, of course, have both congratulated the Taliban. Some of the Palestinian Authority leadership has been talking about, never mind what they're talking about, but it's not happy and it's not healthy. So a lot of Israel's enemies in the region are supported by Iran, both politically and financially. What does the Iran-Taliban relationship mean for them, if anything?
Well, unfortunately, the Iranians own a share in this victory of the Taliban in Afghanistan. One of the nerd points that I've documented is that this was missed again by a lot of our political leaders, is that, remember, the myth is that Iran was very helpful after the overthrow of the Taliban's Islamic Emirate in 2001, and was purely on the side of the international community in trying to stand up a new government. But part of what I documented was that there was a guy at Guantanamo named Karul Kerkwa, I won't use the name again,
That's okay. It's fine.
Who is now a senior Taliban official to this day, right now, after getting out of Guantanamo. And he actually negotiated in 2000, 2001, a rapprochement between the Taliban and the Iranians. He admitted this many times. It held up in a district court, that in fact, he negotiated the agreement on behalf of Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, for the Iranians to help work with the Taliban against us in Afghanistan. And from that moment on, we can point to a number of similar arrangements in which the Iranians have provided facilitation, safe haven, arms, training for different parts of the Taliban's insurgency. And so they they know the Taliban very well. They know it better than we do, and they know how to reach accommodations with them, even though they were opposed to one another back as far as 1998.
Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who is, by the way, the subject of the In Focus interview coming up in the fall issue of In Focus Quarterly. Mike Pompeo and others who were involved in the Trump era negotiations say that their plan would have hemmed in the Taliban during a withdrawal and forced them into power sharing with the Afghani government. Do you think it's true? Do you think it could have been? Do you think it might have happened if, for example, they'd had more time to pursue it?
I can say with certainty that this is absolutely false. I was involved in conversations around this, debates around this. I was documenting it at the time, explaining why this is not true. And I can say with certainty today, this is 0%. To this day, the people who make this claim cannot point to a single shred of evidence showing the Taliban was willing to settle for a political agreement with Kabul. They said over and over again that it was their religious and ideological obligation to restore the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan to power, that was what they were going to do. This is a totalitarian, authoritarian regime. They're getting prepared to have their big moment right now where they say that that's what they've done. There was never any evidence that they were going to share power whatsoever. And they certainly weren't going to be cajoled or coerced into sharing power with a less and less and less of American presence as America is running for the door. So this idea just doesn't make any sense. And unfortunately, I would say Secretary Pompeo and President Trump and several others went a step further and actually portrayed the Taliban as our counterterrorism partner, claiming that, and Secretary Pompeo claimed that the Taliban was going to hunt down and destroy al-Qaeda on our behalf, working alongside us. And all I can say is that is flat false. Now, there are other areas of Secretary Pompeo's record that are quite defensible. This, unfortunately, is not one of them.
So the idea of using the Taliban to hunt down al-Qaeda, were they postulating that the two of them didn't get along? I mean, understanding that their roots go back a long way, was there some assumption that either the Taliban was going to turn on al-Qaeda, or that in fact they were not as close as we now are given to understand they were?
Shoshana, this is one of the key fault lines in this war, is that, there were only a handful of us who understood that there was an encyclopedia worth of evidence showing that this narrative was false. That in fact, the Taliban and al-Qaeda, they're not just two organizations that are allied, they are blood brothers. They are intermingled. And oftentimes you can't tell them apart because you don't really know who's a Taliban guy or who's an al-Qaeda guy. That's the lesson of the Haqqanis, for example. And you can go back to the 1990s. This intermingling started then, right, in the mid-1990s. And of course, Mullah Omar never betrayed Osama bin Laden, would never turn him over to the West. But what happened, what we came to learn, and this is one of the most disturbing aspects of this war, is that this sort of Taliban apologia set in, this narrative, which was basically pretending that the Taliban wasn't really culpable for al-Qaeda's actions in any way, and that the two really weren't all that close together, and that there was this daylight between the two that could be exploited if the circumstances were right. The bottom line is that there's never been any evidence for that. There's never been any reason to believe that. Meanwhile, at Long War Journal, we've been accumulating almost on a daily basis more and more and more evidence of how intertwined the two really are.
There is so much left to learn here. We have a question. Small resistance is mobilizing in the Panjshir Valley. There are some top-tier government officials on board. Hundreds of Afghan soldiers apparently crossed borders into Uzbekistan and Turkestan to escape the Taliban, some with aircraft. Question, do you see a significant resistance forming? What's the likelihood of success?
I think that this could be decided, whether or not they can survive the onslaught, they being the resistance, may be decided in the next week, if not sooner, maybe with hours or days, because right now the Taliban has taken a big shot. We've documented there's probably thousands of Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters who have headed their way. The battle is raging right now. And this is part of the failure of American leadership on both a moral and intellectual level. As the President of the United States was claiming the Afghans don't fight, the last holdouts were getting ready in the Panjshir Valley. Actually, they were fighting at the time, and they were slugging it out, led by Amrul Salah, who was the former first vice president, and Masood's son, who was fighting it out, and others, and militiamen and everything else, who are trying desperately to stop from being brought under the totalitarian yoke of the Taliban's regime. And so, but the America so far hasn't been able to lift a finger in their support or even acknowledge that they're doing this. In fact, the French have kept the fight going or helped keep the fight going for them, while America has abdicated any leadership role. So this is, again, part of the, I say this to people all the time, don't listen to me if you're depressed or down, because you're not going to be happy with what I have to say, even though I'm a generally happy person, but there's been a real failure here in American leadership, and we're going to find out if this resistance can hold on in the coming days.
So one of our listeners actually points to you and says, with your knowledge, do you feel that you are a voice crying in the wilderness, or do you feel that there are people who want to know what you know and want to absorb the lessons from what you teach?
I try not to.
That's the question. Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Right now, well, in terms of my constitution, I'm naturally, I would say, a realist, probably a mix of the two. But I try to be optimistic. But I gotta tell you, after doing this for so many years, it's very tough not to be a pessimist, because I don't want to make too much of myself, but I definitely feel like Cassandra, right? Because there were, in Greek mythology, who kept saying, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. And the Pentagon didn't want to hear it, and political leaders didn't want to hear it, and the State Department didn't want to hear it. And Bill Roggio, my colleague, he mapped out the offensive of the Taliban. The multi-billion-dollar U.S. government didn't map it out, and he did, from his home in New Jersey, and he was explaining what was going on and got it right while they got it wrong, So I think this speaks to a bigger problem that we as Americans, everybody on this call, I think if you take one thing away from me today, we have to grapple with. There is no accountability for failure anymore, right? That I didn't learn about this. Years ago, I was in the business world in a highly competitive environment. And if you failed, you failed, and you knew it right away. It wasn't until I heard somebody else say this too, and I have had the exact same thought. It wasn't until I started working with people in government or dealing with government agencies that I learned of the concept of failing upward, or dealing with the generals in Afghanistan, that you could fail constantly, but as long as you were glad handing the right people and networking with the right people, you could fail upward. So it didn't matter that you failed, just as long as you were saying what people wanted to hear and you were part of the herd, all was good. And that's sort of a pathological thing now in American culture. And I would argue we've seen it across multiple parts of our American elite, so-called elite. And I think this is something we have to grapple with here. I certainly don't have all the answers, but how is it that we can have failure after failure after failure, obvious failures, and there's never any accountability? That's the part that makes me pessimistic and disturbed, because you can't get better, right? You can't make a comeback unless there's some sort of accountability for the failures at hand.
Seems to be true. And excuse me, here a listener points out that the word ISIS has not yet appeared in this program. So could you say something? The president has said that Taliban is a, quote, mortal enemy of ISIS. Really?
Well, the reason why I haven't used ISIS in this program, it's not because we don't study ISIS. I study ISIS every day. There is an ongoing ISIS threat in Kabul. We've talked about that and reported on that. They are trying to play a spoiler here. The reason why I talk a lot more about al-Qaeda in this situation is because if you actually properly understand and define it, al-Qaeda just had a strategic victory, right? ISIS is trying to have a terrorist attack, which could get headlines and be a big problem and kill a lot of people, sure. But ISIS hasn't had a strategic victory in a long time. Al-Qaeda just had a major strategic victory for itself and its organization. And it is true that the Taliban and ISIS have been at loggerheads, and because of Al-Qaeda in particular, but because of other things. So on the one hand, it's the Taliban, Al-Qaeda on one side, and ISIS on the other. ISIS's presence in Afghanistan, it has a lingering presence there, but it really, and again, it could commit a terrorist attack here in the coming days in Kabul or elsewhere. Absolutely, you could see something like that, definitely. And I don't want to downplay that possibility. But they never had anything close to what the Taliban Al-Qaeda axis did. In fact, there was a big axis did. They have a big ideological argument between the two sides. They have operational arguments between the two sides. But I'm going to give you an anecdote to show you how confused the American side became real quick. So ISIS was stationed in eastern Afghanistan, and the Taliban was taking the fight to ISIS in eastern Afghanistan. And the U.S. military said, well, this is good. We'll take out ISIS. ISIS is the big threat. We got to take out ISIS. And ISIS became the shiny object everybody was focused on. And so the U.S. military provided de facto air cover for Taliban forces as they moved in and took the fight to ISIS and wiped it out. We argue that this was silly and kind of stupid, actually, because the problem is that ISIS never challenged to overthrow the government in Kabul or to take hold of the country. As we knew at the time and years beforehand, it was the Taliban and Al-Qaeda that could overthrow Kabul, not ISIS. And so you were taking away an enemy or a rival of the entity and the organization and the people who actually could win the war in Afghanistan. Now, that doesn't mean you don't fight ISIS, but why would you come to the aid of the Taliban in Afghanistan? But here's the punchline. Here's the punchline most people don't know. we actually had al-Qaeda's literature in Urdu translated English. And it wasn't the Taliban that the US was providing air cover for. It was al-Qaeda. It was al-Qaeda's commanders, including these guys who were in bed with the Haqqanis, who actually took the fight and beat ISIS in eastern Afghanistan. So this speaks to how confused the US military became in Afghanistan, that they didn't even know who they were fighting or on whose behalf they were fighting. They didn't even know anymore. They were confused. And that speaks to the systemic failures I'm talking about here.
So we're coming to the end of our program, and everybody's confused in the government, in the military. I was
hoping the listeners aren't confused.
Well, I'm sure that, and I'm
Yeah.
less confused than I was, but what really
Yeah.
disturbs me is how confused this situation actually is, and
Yeah.
for how many years. And it's not a question of political parties, and it's not a question of whether you like
Right.
this president or that president, but
Right.
across time and space and politics, we have been confused. Now,
Yeah.
people who listen to this show on a regular basis know that I, being an optimist, like to end every program on an optimistic note. Thomas, you're making it very difficult because I don't know where we're supposed to go now. But we have come to the end, and we are approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And I know that President Biden had certain plans about what he thought it was going to look like, and it's not going to look like that.
No.
Is there something that you can say that is a plus note from any of this? And if there isn't, then just wave your hands at me and we're going to turn off the cameras. Is there any plus here?
You know, I don't know if there's a plus here or not. Obviously, the story when it comes to Kabul and Afghanistan isn't over. We got days to come here. But I'll say from doing this, the plus is this, that when I've been talking about this crisis and explaining the systemic failures, I've met, even in the last week or 8 days, a lot of good people who I think feel like they have heard a call to arms, that there's something they have to do now to right this ship going forward. And if there's a positive here, is that all these negative things, all the down things I'm talking about, I'm not saying that because I hope that's the end of the story. I'm hoping that's just the beginning, that basically people realize that we can't do this again. We can't have these types of failures again, but it's up to us, everybody on this call and everybody we meet, to make it a better future. So maybe that's your optimistic note.
And as things go these days, that's not a bad one. I appreciate it. I think we've ended on a decently up note. Maybe this is the beginning of the next period of time in which we ponder these things. Thomas, Jocelyn, thank you very much for an enlightening, if not altogether happy presentation. I know we learned a lot. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week, beginning of September. And just keep looking for those positives. And read the Long War Journal, because if you want to know on an ongoing basis where we are and where we ought to be, please take the opportunity to find the Long War Journal and read it. Thank you all for being with us, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thomas, thank you again.
Thank you.